This is a man's opinion that I have been looking forward to having in conversation all week. I'm so happy to welcome to the show Dr. Gad Saad, visiting professor and global ambassador at Northwood University, evolutionary behavioral scientist and author. In other words, far, far smarter than me. Doctor, welcome to the show.
Oh, so good to be with you. Thank you so much for having me.
So listen, I just finished your book, The Parasitic Mind, and I would love if you could just give us the thesis. Give us the thesis of the thrust of that book.
Right. So in the animal kingdom, there's a field called parasitology, which basically studies how parasites and hosts have co-evolved. So for example, a tapeworm looks to your intestinal tract to parasitize it. Neuroparasitology is when a parasite looks for the host's brain to alter its neuronal circuitry to suit its reproductive interests. So for example, you have a wood cricket that abhors water. It wants nothing to do with water. But when it is parasitized by a hairworm, the hairworm needs the wood cricket to jump into water in order for the parasite to complete its reproductive cycle. And so that was my epiphany. I thought, aha, I'm going to now use the neuroparasitological framework to argue that human beings can be parasitized by another class of brainworms, and I call these idea pathogens. And so what the book does is it traces where all these parasitic ideas come from, and regrettably, Ben, they all come from university campuses because it takes professors to come up with some of the dumbest ideas. and then these ideas proliferate to every nook and cranny of society, as we've seen over the past 10, 15, 20 years. And at the end of the book, I offer, hopefully, an effective mind vaccine against the lunacy.
Well, you argue about the sort of the duality of the human condition, the analytical mind and the emotional mind, and you posit that in places and spaces and in subject matter where we should be thinking analytically, we have chosen the emotional brain, and that's the cause of a lot of the issues that we deal with today in society.
Yeah, that's a perfect synopsis. So look, it is a false dichotomy to argue that reason takes precedence over affect or feelings. We are both a thinking and feeling animal, but what matters in life is that you invoke the right system at the right time. So if I'm taking a shortcut to get home through a dark alley and I see four young men that look suspicious that are loitering around, I will have an emotional-based fear response that makes perfect evolutionary sense for me to have that response. On the other hand, if I'm trying to do well on a calculus exam, all of the fear response in the world is not going to make me, perform better on that exam. So when it comes to, say, choosing a prime minister or a president, you would like to think that the electorate is going to invoke their cognitive system, but regrettably, to your synopsis, most people end up voting with their feelings. He's tall, he has beautiful hair, he's young, he looks empathetic. So at no point did the electorate say, I like him or dislike him because of policy reasons A, B, C. I simply use peripheral affective cues to make my judgment. That's not a good idea.
So I guess through that lens, you could explain some things that have boggled my mind. Like, how did we get from a point in time where, prior to the murder of George Floyd, which was a disgusting abuse of police power, but prior to his murder, we were living in what at that point was the fairest, most equitable version of Western society at any point. Now, we weren't perfect, we weren't where we want to be, but it's the struggle to get to that level that makes Western society great. And then, but with that catalyst of his murder, people started feeling like society was unfair. People started feeling like there was a patriarchy. People started feeling like everywhere you looked, people who look like me had our boot on our heel on somebody's neck. Is that a fair way of looking at it?
I mean, the part that I might, disagree with is that, George Floyd was the catalyst. Now, it is true that George Floyd, instigated all sorts of subsequent realities downstream, but the parasitic ideas that allowed the post-George Floyd reality to happen have been festering in academic ecosystems for 50 to 100 years. So it's not as though we needed George Floyd's, brutal murder to be where we are. The abyss of infinite lunacy has been unfolding regrettably for many, many years. So I'll give you an example. Postmodernism, I argue it's the granddaddy of all parasitic ideas, is really a form of intellectual terrorism, because it says that it purports that there are no objective truths other than the one objective truth, that there are no objective truths. Well, that framework then provides the room for us to say up is down, freedom is slavery, war is peace, women can have penises. Of course, men too can menstruate. So yes, the George Floyd incident served as a catalyst for some realities, but the problem is much more longstanding than that.
It sounds like you say, yes, so much of this is coming from the universities and our places of higher education. Was that done by design? Was it orchestrated?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So I argue in the book that each of these parasitic ideas, and let me just at the very least mention them so that your listeners have a clue of what I'm talking about. So I just mentioned postmodernism. Another idea pathogen is cultural relativism.
Yeah.
Who are we to judge the rituals and behaviors and beliefs of another culture? Another one is political correctness. Another one is identity politics, social constructivism. Everything is due to social construction. Biology doesn't matter in explaining human affairs. So each of these parasitic ideas have served as, if you like, a plane of BS hitting our edifices of reason, right? Now, each of these parasitic ideas, to your question, starts off with a noble cause. So no, it's not by some willful evil design that we got here. So let me give a specific example. Equity feminism is a great idea. There should be no institutional or legal reasons why men and women shouldn't be treated equally under the law. By that definition, both you and I would put up our hands and say, hey, we're proud equity feminists. But then radical feminists came along and said, in order for us to accelerate the squashing of the evil, toxic, masculine patriarchy, we need to argue that there are no innate sex differences between men and women. They're all due to social construction, because that will allow us to better serve our ultimate goal of squashing the patriarchy. So in the service of what started originally as a noble goal, if we have to rape and murder truth, so be it. And so I argue that each of these parasitic ideas started from a noble place and then metamorphosized into nonsense.
And of course, this dovetails very nicely into your other book, the Suicidal Empathy, that states that excessive compassion undermines societal cohesion, values, and security.
Exactly right. So let me kind of give you the background to the sort of the 1-2 punch of those two books. In the parasitic mind, I'm arguing that our cognitive system, hence, right, our thought processes, could be parasitized by bad ideas. But as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, we are both a thinking and feeling animal. So not only could our cognitive system be parasitized, so can our emotional system, and hence suicidal empathy. Look, within certain functional norms, being empathetic is perfectly laudable, right? We've actually evolved empathy as part of our human sociality. I need to be able to put myself in your mind. This is called theory of mind, in order for you and I to have a productive exchange. So it makes perfect evolutionary sense for social species to experience the sentiment of empathy. But of course, the devil is in the details. If empathy becomes hyperactive, if it targets the wrong targets, then it becomes dysfunctional. And
Dr. Saad, we're
Yes.
going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back on the Ben Mulrooney Show, more in conversation with Dr. Gad Saad. This is the Ben Mulrooney Show, and this is The Conversation with the author of Suicidal Empathy and the Parasitic Mind, Dr. Gad Saad. Doctor, thank you so much for sticking around. 3 years ago, we could not have had this conversation without worrying, at least by myself, worrying that the online mob would come to cancel me. And something seems to have changed in society, and I don't know what to put my finger on.
Well, it's a combination of things. It takes a while for people to find their spines, for them to find their testicular fortitude, if you excuse the term. And so, like anything, for example, shingles is something that is within you, and then something will or will not trigger it. So there are many triggers that resulted in people finally finding their voice. I mean, certainly it helped, without wanting to, turn this into a political conversation. The fact that Donald Trump now won certainly is going to change the
Yeah.
landscape, at least in the United
Yeah,
States.
it feels, Doctor, it feels like and I was talking about with my producer about this morning, that nothing really changed in Donald Trump. The moment met him. The world that he was railing against years ago, that people thought he was crazy about, has manifested, and he went to where the puck was going to be.
You're exactly right. And I mean, I will draw an analogy in my own personal life, right? And or my professional life. The exact same people who used to want to, if disassociate themselves from me in academia, or ignore me or ostracize me, are now lining up to all send me letters of invitations and awards and so on, because they've always loved my work. Well, unfortunately for them, I've kept a copy of the emails that I had received 20 years
Yeah.
ago. And so while I wish to be charitable and not be too gleeful,
You've
a
got the
lot of
receipts.
I've got the receipts.
Is there a flashpoint? Is there a moment where the force of the cancel culture hurricane waned?
I mean, I think there are several of them. Look, seeing a male pummel a bunch of women in the Olympics is certainly one, right? I mean, people love to see things vividly, right? And so when you're talking in the abstract, it's difficult to get people to understand what the problem is. But if you're seeing, a 6'5", guy who used to be called John yesterday, now playing rugby with 5'2" women, people will eventually wake up. So I don't think there's a singular moment, but there is a confluence of factors that led to the fact that there is now an autocorrection taking place.
Yeah, I think a lot of it had to do with people telling us that the reality that we could see with our very own eyes and hear with our very own ears was not real. Don't trust your own senses. We're telling you everything's fine. The house isn't burning down. You can stay in your bed. Everything's fine. And at some point, a lot of rational people said, wait, hold on. I can feel the heat and my clothes are on fire. And you're talking to me like I'm an idiot.
Right. But what upsets me, though, Ben, is that it takes for us to get this far into the abyss of infinite lunacy before people wake up. So, for example, I know of many very wealthy Americans, Jewish Americans, who are now suddenly waking up to the fact, oh boy, we've got a real anti-Semitic problem at my alma mater. Well, why weren't you able to connect the dots together when some of us were standing on top of the mountain screaming for 30 years? But the reality is that the architecture of the human mind is such that you only wake up when it comes to bite you, and then you suddenly realize that, oh yes, there is such a thing as diabetes. Until I get diabetes,
Yeah.
it doesn't exist.
And I've got to wonder, you've got guys like Joe Rogan who are a greater force in media than I think all of legacy media combined. You saw the numbers that Pierre Poilievre got during his sit down with Jordan Peterson, bypassing the traditional media altogether. Are these buttressing forces against the pendulum swinging so wildly back to where it had been?
Right. And by the way, you're exactly right. Look, I am in the business of creating knowledge and spreading knowledge. So I will go wherever I need to go in order to make that happen. So as you may or may not know, Ben, I'm proud to say I'm one of the guests that's been most often on Joe Rogan. I think I recently reached 10 appearances on his show. But I'll tell you a quick story, which I discuss in The Parasitic Mind. I had gone to give a talk at the Stanford Business School in 2017, one of the meccas of prestige in academia. And the gentleman, who was a fellow professor, a consumer psychologist, who had taken me out to dinner the night before, looked down with unbelievable smugness at the idea that I would go on Joe Rogan. Well, to my earlier point, those same people who thought that it was beneath them to speak to the great unwashed that might listen to Joe Rogan now write to me and say, oh, please, can you introduce me to Joe Rogan? So that's what happens.
Yeah. But given the fact, let's go back to the top of our conversation where we said that so many of these bad and toxic ideas stem from our universities and places of higher education. How do we deprogram those faculties so that they don't keep churning out. They're not the factories of misinformation and brainwashing.
Well, I mean, the most important thing to, and I think we alluded to this earlier, is to get people to find their courage to speak out. If your professor is espousing nonsense like, of course, men too can menstruate, raise your hand and challenge him or her politely. If your friend at the pub is saying stuff that they learned in their lesbian dance therapy class at Oberlin College about the evil Jews and so on, maybe challenge him. In other words, don't let any opportunity bypass you to at least challenge bad ideas. There is no magic recipe. You just have to be involved.
I mean, I remember clear as day the very first time I was in high school and had an original thought of my own. I remember it. I remember where I was, and it was such a defining moment for me. I said, oh, that's what education is. Going up and challenging your teacher, challenging your professor. And I looked forward to that. And I engaged in that when I was in university. And for the past few years, it has been completely forbidden to have to be an outlier. If you're an outlier, you're a heretic.
Indeed. And by the way, you don't know how thrilled I am to be speaking to you, because, it's unbelievable how much Canadian media has ignored me, right? I mean, I can go to Belgium and people will know me, but in my own backyard, nearly everyone has ignored me. As they say, prophets are not appreciated in their homeland, or whatever the expression is. And so I'm so glad to see that the tide is changing, and boy, I'm so glad to be able to be speaking to you, because Canada, when it comes to woke metrics, is certainly suffering from a fatal disease.
Oh no, we are behind the times. As that pendulum is swinging, I said that this is woke culture is going to still find a home here in Canada, and certainly in cities like Toronto. This will be their Stalingrad.
Well, although, if I may, I know that there's always a rivalry between Montreal and Toronto. You should come and walk around in my home university to really see what parasitized wokesters look like.
Oh, I hear it's terrible. I hear it's absolutely terrible.
Well, it is so terrible that regrettably I've had to take a leave. That's why I'm at Northwood University, right? Where, they truly believe in freedom of inquiry, economic freedom, freedom of speech. I mean, those are the bedrock of Western civilization. But apparently, if you now espouse those positions, you are an extremist.
So it's going to take years, you're saying, before we peel away the nonsense and the toxicity at our Canadian universities.
Absolutely. And that's why I keep reminding people, Ben, that yes, you may be happy that Donald Trump won, but Donald Trump is just a doorstop for this craziness, right? Yes, it's good that he's going to, autocorrect some lunacy, but it's a much longer battle. I'd like to think that it won't take 50 to 100 years to autocorrect, but it certainly is a generational battle.
Dr. Gad Saad, it has been a pleasure having you in conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on the Ben Mulrooney Show. Let's do it again sometime.
Anytime. Thank you so much, sir.
Oh, what a treat. What a treat to speak with him. I really hope we get to do it again.